A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and let me thank the organizers for inviting me to share my thoughts at the BT India 100 Summit. I'm sure many of you would have seen some of the social media posts on my recent book, India at 100. So I'm going to share briefly some of the thoughts in the book, and then hopefully we can take some questions. So the bottom line, I am estimating India to be a $55 trillion economy in 2047 when India turns 100. I'm sure many of you will find this goal audacious, but I'll hopefully in the next 10 minutes and then during questions I can convince you that this is achievable. Let me start with a couple of examples. Take Japan from 1970 to 1995. The Japanese economy in 1970 was $215 billion. By 1995, its economy had multiplied almost 25 times to $5.5 trillion, 25 times multiplication. Now, this was not a period where it was a honeymoon for the Japanese economy or the global economy. I'm sure many of us recall that the 70s were a period of war, the Vietnam War. There was also the oil shock and the hyperinflation that happened, the Volcker phenomenon, very high double-digit interest rates in the US, all of which had an impact on global demand as well. So the Japanese economy was able to grow 25 times during this period, despite the challenges that inevitably came. Secondly, if we take the Chinese economy, from 1996 to 2021, another 25-year period, the Chinese economy grew 22 times. Our economy in 2023 was about $3.3 trillion. And so I'm projecting a much lower increase in the size of the Indian economy, about 15 times to 55 trillion. But let me take you through the economics that underlies why I think this is, a prediction that is indeed achievable. If you look at Japan from 1970 to 1995, that period, the Japanese yen appreciated almost 4 times, from 350 yen to the dollar in 1970 to 85 yen to the dollar. Now, I am not projecting anywhere close to an appreciation of the currency, certainly not 4 times appreciation of the rupee. What I am estimating, and if you get a chance to take a look at the book, as is my training, I have provided data and economic logic to back every estimation that I have, whether it is the growth that can happen in real terms, whether it is the depreciation of the currency, all of that is backed with data and evidence. After all, as a researcher, I've been trained in the Sherlock Holmes philosophy to never theorize before you have the data. So let me explain to you the economics behind this prediction. If we can grow at in real terms at 8% from here on, and I'll spend some time explaining to you why I think that is a growth target that is ambitious, but it is achievable. If you look at the rate of inflation that has prevailed in India from 2016 onwards, and when we celebrate the centennial year, when we will write India's economic history, 2016 will be a very important year, because that was the year India implemented its inflation targeting regime. Pre-2016, India's inflation was about 7.5%. Since 2016, up until March 2024 data, the average inflation has been precisely 5%. In other words, there has been a decline in inflation from 7.5% to 5%. And that is why I am going to take the estimate of inflation into the future as 5%. As you all know, the inflation targeting regime requires the central bank to target inflation at 4% plus minus 2%. In other words, in this band between 2% to 6%. So not only is 5% in the, in the higher number, it is also the case that the historical average inflation from 2016, when the inflation targeting regime was implemented, inflation has been 5%. So it's a very reasonable estimate, therefore, that the inflation going forward will be, will be 5%. Now, one of the fundamental tenets of international economics is that a currency that experiences higher inflation is one that will also experience higher depreciation. Why? Because in order to keep the real value of the currency the same, in other words, the purchasing power the same, or therefore saying that there is no real appreciation of the currency, if the currency that experiences higher inflation, what will happen is the purchasing power of that currency will decline, and therefore, in order to offset that, the currency has to depreciate more. So this translates, therefore, into a one-to-one relationship between the inflation in the currency to the rate of depreciation. So I hope now you're able to see that the decline in inflation from 7.5%, which is what the rate of inflation was from 1991 till 2016, decline from 7.5% to 5% will have a decline, concomitant decline in the rate of depreciation. Now, when you look at the data for the rate of depreciation of the rupee every year, from 1991 onwards, the rate of depreciation has been historically between 3 to 3.5%. Now, this was a period where, as I said, the inflation had been 7.5%. US inflation was 2%. So the difference between the two inflations was 5.5%. But there was real appreciation of the currency at about 1.5%. But that was drowned by the higher, the difference in inflation, leading to depreciation of 3 to 3.5%. Now, ceteris paribus, keep everything else the same. Just take into account the fact that India's inflation has declined from 7.5% to 5%. Therefore, there will be a 2 to 2.5% reduction in the rate of depreciation. And this is a very important macro phenomenon. If you look at earlier projections, by Ernst & Young or Goldman Sachs, they have not taken that into account. The fact that a lower rate of inflation will mean a lower rate of depreciation of the currency. If, in fact, their projections, and I've tried to back calculate that, assumes the rate of depreciation of the rupee to be the same as has been in the past. So compared to 3 to 3.5% depreciation that has prevailed, a reduction in inflation by 2.5% will mean substantially lower rate of depreciation. As I said, I am not projecting the rupee to appreciate. That can happen. It can happen because the US rate of inflation actually may be higher than 2%. I've assumed it to be 2% because the fiscal situation is far different from what it has been in the past. Not just that, there could be other tailwinds and maybe potentially headwinds also that could come in. So I'm not projecting, any real appreciation of the currency, but a significantly lower rate of depreciation instead of 3.5% at 1%. So now let's do let's do some number crunching. Mentally, I know this is the end of the day, but if I can be excited about this, having spoken about it a few times, I'm sure I can see some excitement with all of you as well. So let's do this number crunching. Be with me. 8% in real terms, 5% inflation, 8 plus 5 is 13% in nominal rupee terms, right? Now, when I have to estimate the rate of growth in dollars, I have to subtract the rate of depreciation. Why? Because depreciation reduces the value in dollar terms when compared to rupees. So let's subtract the 1% rate of depreciation. As I explained in the book, I'm actually projecting the rate of depreciation to be 0.5%, but here in the calculations, I'm being, a little bit more conservative so that I can work with round numbers. So 13% minus 1% is 12% in dollar terms. In other words, this is nominal dollars, by the way. This is not real dollars. Nominal dollars, 12%. I'm sure, this audience is intelligent enough, expert enough to know the rule of 72. I'm sure you've actually, done your calculations and doubled your money many times. So the rule of 72 basically tells you how many years it takes to double your money. Let's apply the same thing. 12% growth in dollar terms, rule of 72 means that GDP will double every 6 years, From 2023 to 2047 is a 24-year period. So if GDP doubles every 6 years, there are 4 doublings. And now, as I said, GDP in 2023 was slightly less than 3.3. Let's take it to be 3.25. So from 3.25 to 6.5, that's the first doubling. 6.5 to 13 is the second doubling. 13 to 26 is the third doubling. And 26 to 52 is the fourth doubling, which is close to the 55 trillion number that I've precisely estimated in the book. Now you can see if there are only 3 doublings, which is what will happen if I change the math a little bit, especially assume the rate of depreciation to be, 3.5%, then you are basically getting growth in dollar terms at 9%. At 9% dollar growth, your GDP doubles every 8 years, in which case over a 24-year period, you only get 3 doublings, which takes you to 26. So as you can see that one of the crucial, this is in some sense the power of compounding. What the Japanese economy, what the Chinese economy enjoyed was this power of compounding. And if we can grow at 8% as well with 5% inflation, we will enjoy that power of compounding as well with the lower rate of depreciation. And over a 20-25 year period, fundamentals have to show up in the economy. And I've tested this, by the way, over various periods. In the book, I've shown tests over various 25-year periods, but I've tested it for past 20-year periods. I've tested it for 15-year periods and 10-year periods. And interestingly, what I find is that this framework does not work very well for 10-year periods. In other words, when the horizon is shorter, it doesn't show up as well. But over 15 year, 20 years and 25-year periods, it works very well. The actual predicted depreciation and the actual depreciation are very close to each other. And that gives me, therefore, the confidence that what I'm estimating, for the future, is credible. So let me just spend just a couple of minutes on the important, goal or the important ambition of 8% growth. Now, while writing the book, I spent a lot of time thinking about, can India indeed grow at 8% for 2.5 decades, 23 years? That's a question that will come to everybody's mind. And I spent a lot of time contemplating on that, reading a lot as well. And one of the important takeaways for me, which is what actually I have shared, in the book with you all, is that many times when we try to think about about economies, we subconsciously or consciously have growth patterns in advanced economies at the back of our mind, because a lot of economics that we've learned is from basically growth patterns in the advanced economies. And here it is critical to understand that when it comes to the advanced economies, their growth over the last half a century or so has primarily come from productivity growth in the formal sector firms. Why? Because when you think about growth is basically just a function of 2 things: the rate of investment in the economy and the productivity. Or productivity is basically what is the return you're making on that investment. Now, these advanced economies have done their investment. They've built their bridges, their airports, their ports, all this stuff. So the investment is almost saturated. As a result, the growth has come primarily from productivity improvements because of, the economy has been almost formalized. And this productivity growth itself has come from shocks to productivity, which is, if you take, for instance, the late 90s, it was the internet that actually generated that productivity shock, increased productivity. Later in the 2000s, it was the outsourcing phenomenon, outsourcing manufacturing to China, services to India, that provided the next productivity shock. And now, in the advanced economies, people are talking about generative AI as providing that productivity shock. In other words, what I'm summarizing here is that in the advanced economies, it is productivity shocks that have actually led to increases in productivity, thereby growth in these economies. But that is where the Indian growth pattern will be different from the advanced economies, because for one, we have still a very large informal sector. Estimates vary, but anywhere between half to 2/3, or even some estimates put it about 3/4 of the economy is still informal. And I'm sure, this audience does not need me to convince that productivity in the formal sector is significantly higher than productivity in the informal sector. So one of the key drivers of productivity growth will be the formalization itself, which itself has, that has already started happening through the public digital infrastructure that we have, and related, whether it's the, OCEN or the, ONDC, all these that are actually being created, these are all will really help bring formalization in the economy. That's the first driver. The second driver, and this is, so the first driver basically was not there for a advanced economy. This is something that is very peculiar, to economies like India, China, etc. Second, if you look at even within the formal sector, firms in the formal sector, Indian firms in the formal sector are much less productive compared to their global peers. And this is something, which this audience actually will hopefully think about and work on. Estimates again vary here. Some firms are actually about, let's say, 1/3 as productive. Some are maybe 1/4 as productive. But that also provides a large runway for productivity growth and catch up with the global peers. And here again, the momentum that we have on two things, which is innovation and entrepreneurship, are really critical. I want to just give you a little bit of, data on this so that you can see that, all of this I'm sort of estimating in a very credible way. If you take entrepreneurship, new firm creation using the World Bank data from 2004 to 2014 was 3.2%. The same rate of, this was the CAGR growth, in new firms, World Bank data. Same World Bank data from 2014 onwards, new firm creation is orders of magnitude higher. As a result, you actually have the third largest entrepreneurial ecosystem in the world, more than 100 unicorns, and that will actually help with productivity growth in the formal sector. Why? Because not only do entrepreneurial firms raise their own productivity, but they also push incumbent firms. It's as if incumbent firms are on a treadmill and they have to continue running on the treadmill in order to stay where they are. Otherwise, they lose business. And therefore, that is something which will actually also help productivity improvement. Secondly, innovation. We covered this in the economic survey in 2019-20. For the first time in 2019, India entered the top 50 countries in the Global Innovation Index. As of now, India is part of the top 40. Now, if you ask me, am I happy with top 40 in the global innovation? I'm not, of course. The fifth largest economy should be aspiring to be part of the top 10, in terms of innovation, or maybe top 15, top 20. But we will get there. But I think, maybe about a decade back, we were not even in the top 100. And here we are in the top 40. So there is momentum. Much like in entrepreneurship, there's momentum. In innovation also, there is momentum. And these will further productivity improvements in the formal sector. That's your second driver. The final driver is essentially, is an aspect that, is very close to my heart, which is, as a financial economist, which is credit creation in the economy. Here, let me give you some data, and hopefully, at least this data, among many other pieces of data that I'm giving you, will stick with you, because this is really a very, very important aspect. So if you look at the ratio of private credit to GDP, which captures the extent of credit penetration in any economy, for India, in 2020, the private credit to GDP ratio was 58%. 6 decades back, in 1960, the world average for private credit to GDP ratio was 60%. Just reflect on that for a minute, that we are 6 decades behind in credit penetration, at 58% in 2020, when the global average for private credit to GDP ratio in 1960 was 60%. And even this does not capture the full phenomenon, because if you open the hood, you'll see that SME credit has not grown much, except during the COVID period due to the ECGLS scheme. And large sections of our population, particularly in Eastern India, Northeastern India, etc., actually credit creation is very, very low. Now, many look for challenges in opportunities. I have the tendency to look for opportunities in every challenge. And therefore, to me, credit creation is actually an opportunity, especially, again, and in a credible way. If you think about it, we have put in place, our banks have cleaned up, been cleaned up well. But the corporate sector also actually has been, has deleveraged, and the formalization, the public digital infrastructure that we've created is a tool that can really be used for, widespread credit growth. And therefore, the runway for credit creation is substantial. That's your third driver. Together, these, if you look at, if you look at our average growth over the last 30 years from 1991 onwards, despite whatever, improvements that we've not yet had on human capital, despite our judicial system, despite the, whatever we have on, improvements we have to make on the bureaucracy, we've still been able to register 7% growth. So with these drivers, which actually we can tap into, we can grow at 8%. Not just that, and these are some of the, in my opinion, the lower hanging fruits, but there are fruits at at levels that are actually slightly above the low-hanging level as well, which is, if you take, for instance, human capital, you have, the investments in healthcare, education that can actually further human capital significantly, digital capital, there's significant growth that can happen. And at the same time, the judiciary, the bureaucracy, those are also aspects that can be actually at maybe, even higher fruits, but they are fruits that can be plucked. In other words, bottom line, over the next 20 odd years, there are enough fruits, there's enough work to do for us to be able to, take these fruits, eat them and then reflect them in productivity and thereby, and thereby growth so that we can grow at 8%. And thereby become a $55 trillion economy. I will end with a parallel so that, at least the main idea is crystallized well. It comes from, one of my passions, cricket. Back in 1993, I'm sure, many of you will remember, Sachin Tendulkar had played cricket for 4 years, 1989. All of us remember him facing bravely to that trio of Wasim Akram, Waqar Yunus and Imran Khan, that bloodied nose, and then his first 100 at Edgbaston, and then he goes to Perth and hits that 100 that even today people rave about. 4 years of performance that then makes Sunil Gavaskar assess his potential, saying what can he do when he ends his career. He says at that time, and I remember this statement is actually stuck in my memory, says, if Sachin Tendulkar, by the time he's finished his career, has not scored at least 12,000 international runs and 40 international hundreds, I'll personally go and strangle him. Of course, this was a paternalistic statement that actually captured the potential. Now, did Sunil Gavaskar make that assessment of the potential in 1988 when Sachin had never played Test match cricket? No. After seeing 4 years of performance, it actually assessed his potential. I have no claim to be the Sunil Gavaskar of anything, but the Indian economy has demonstrated performance over, the last 3 decades, especially the last 10 years. Based on that, I can assess, therefore, the potential of the economy. But there's an even more important lesson in this Sachin Tendulkar example that I've given you, which is that just because Sunil Gavaskar thought that this is his potential, that did not lead him to actually, eventual performance of 100 international hundreds and 15,000 international runs. It was the hard work he did. It was the ability to overcome setbacks, which will come eventually. There will be setbacks, there will be challenges. But at the same time, while there'll be headwinds, there'll be potential tailwinds as well. When Sunil Gavaskar was talking about, this potential, he did not factor in the tailwind of the, quartet of Rahul Dravid, Saurav Ganguly, VVS Lakshman and Virendra Sehwag coming and helping Sachin Tendulkar as a batsman itself. So there will be the headwinds like the tennis elbow that he had, but there'll be tailwinds as well when we, when we go through, over the next 23 year period. In other words, if states and center together, and here I do want to put the spotlight on states, because in a federal structure, if you look at, and here, we have the doyens of industry and media here, I want to urge you, pray to you, that we need to put equal spotlight on the states. When the center's budget is presented, there's a lot of spotlight. Absolutely, we should, and rightly so. But do we have a discussion on the budget that, that the Maharashtra government presented? What are the reforms that were announced there? What about the Gujarat budget? What about the Tamil Nadu budget? What about the Telangana budget? No, but these are really important states. And in a federal structure, when states talk about their power and responsibility are but two sides of the same coin. And therefore, it is for us, the media, and for the industry and citizens like us to actually put the spotlight on the responsibility, asking on manufacturing, what are the reforms you've done to further manufacturing? What have you done for service sector? Ask them about reforms equally. What have you done on education? What are you doing on healthcare? This is really important. This is the part of hard work that a Sachin Tendulkar did that the Indian economy needs to do. If we do that, absolutely no hesitation, we can be the Sachin Tendulkar of the global economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Subramanian. And now let me invite on stage Mr. Saurabh Majumdar, Editor Business Today, for a panel discussion and a session that he will be moderating with Dr. Subramanian.
True to the star professor that he is, he made an impassioned plea and backed it up with facts and figures. very difficult to sort of counter him on some of the assumptions he has made, because, as he said, that he's the Sherlock Holmes based on data. But Professor, I have a couple of questions, and would like to pick your brains on those. One, of course, is the World Bank has recently talked about, and I'm sure you're already smiling, so you know that this has been asked of you, I'm sure, has talked about a middle income trap and how it may take as much as 75 years for India to move up the income chain. Now, what if India is indeed poised, like you said, to be the Sachin Tendulkar of the global economy? What is the World Bank missing?
First of all, thank you very much. So there is a chapter specifically, in the book, which is titled, "Is the Middle Income Trap Destiny? ? No! ! The reason it is important is that whenever one talks about a country, growing from low income to middle income to up, higher income, upper income status, the question about the middle income track inevitably arises. And, I've provided a lot of data. I think it's important to understand a few things. First, the definition of the middle income trap itself is so large that if your trap is, let's say this entire room is a trap, all of us are trapped in this room, right? But if the trap is small enough, then there's a possibility of us escaping the trap. By keeping the definition, I'm using rough numbers here, but I think about from $3,000 per capita to about $12,000, $12,500. So even if, let's say, a country doubles its GDP per capita, not just doubles, but maybe 4 times from 3,000 to 12,000, is still stuck in that middle income trap. So I think that's point number one. Second point that needs to be understood here is that if you look at, again, the data, what is called transition matrix from low income to middle income, and then middle income to high income, etc. Look at 2000, look at 2015 as well. What are the percentage of countries that are migrating? About half of the countries actually did migrate, out of the middle income trap. And I think that's point number 2. The third point, which is, equally important to keep in mind, is that if you look at the growth rates of middle income countries, and the middle income trap arises from this notion that middle income countries will have growth that is actually lower than both the high income countries and the low income countries. But when you go and check the data from 2000 to 2020, if I remember exactly, right, but it's there in the book, except for 3 years, during this period, every other year, the middle income countries actually had higher growth than both these. So, the fundamental premise that leads to this, claim of a middle income trap, I've given you 3 pieces of evidence, all of which basically question the idea of the middle income trap. Lastly, and, let me acknowledge that if you look at Latin American countries, you look at, South Africa, they have actually been stuck in a middle income trap. So it's, neither is, for instance, some of the, commentary that is given in India. There are people, some of them former finance ministers, will say that, India becoming the 3rd largest economy or India becoming a $5 trillion economy is all inevitable. That is not right either, because growth is not inevitable. You have to implement good policies to be able to grow. And I think the examples of countries that have been caught in a middle income trap is actually evidence of that. But there's good research in economics which shows both necessary and sufficient conditions for a country to be able to escape the middle income trap. And that's an aspect that I've covered in great detail. The first thing is, and there's a lot of research in this, manufacturing, is a really critical element of being able to, there's research now, very good research by Danny Roderick at Harvard University and others. Danny Roderick, for instance, has a paper, in economics, there is this concept of what is called, unconditional convergence, which is, unconditional convergence is basically what is the claim that is made by these commentators saying, it is actually anyway, we'll converge. But the data shows very clearly that there is no unconditional convergence. What you get is actually conditional convergence. In other words, that if countries implement some correct mix of policies, then they actually are able to converge. And manufacturing sector growth is a really critical part of this, which Danny Roderick shows in a paper. At the same time, there are also other conditions, which is one of which is essentially productivity growth. And in that, in the preface to the book, and also in the first chapter, I cover this. If you use the Penn World Tables data, which economists across the world use to try and understand growth drivers, from 2002 to 2013, the rate of productivity growth of the Indian economy was 1.3% per annum. From 2014 onwards, the rate of productivity growth for the Indian economy has been 2.7% per annum. Let me repeat these numbers once again. 2002 to 2013, 1.3%. From 2014 onwards, more than double at 2.7%. In other words, some of the preconditions that actually necessary conditions for escaping the middle income trap, there is some momentum. I'm not saying that, we basically can declare victory. We have to continue working on this. But I'm sure you will agree with me, that if, for instance, you have become more productive, a book that you used to read, let's say in 2 weeks, if you're reading in 1 week, you're not going to go back to that, earlier productivity of 2 weeks. Same thing for countries as well.
It's a virtuous...
Exactly. So that necessary condition, which is productivity growth. Second is rule of law. And I think that's where, the judicial reforms, bureaucratic reforms are really critical for us to actually establish greater, traction in that area. And these are really critical. Lastly, and this is a very important, if you look at the Latin American economies or, and especially the Latin American economies, the growth models that actually brought them to middle income, they were not able to nuance those growth models to be able to then move into high income status. In particular, what happened is, and I'll use, for instance, the PLI scheme as an example, or any scheme where you're actually productive, supporting industry. When you are supporting industry, when they're getting this, this subsidy, this support, of course, that's the constituent that gets that support grows and then becomes powerful. But it also becomes a very large vested interest then that opposes removing that, and that can hurt growth. And therefore, an important warning which I have in the book, which is every policy that we have for support, it is important that there is a sunset period for that. And the way I like to explain this is, all of us, or many of us are parents here, we support our children till they become 18, till they become adults. But if the child knows that I'm going to support the kid even when he or she is 50, he'll never ever learn to actually become, self-sufficient and develop the capabilities. The government in a similar manner actually cannot be subsidizing, 30-year-old, 40-year-old firms which have basically grown, but have, which have grown in age, but have not continued to be dwarfs. So this aspect of sunset policy, very critical element, that refinement in economic models as we grow is important. And for that, especially some of these subsidy schemes, I think they have to have a sunset period. They cannot be ad infinitum.
Before I let you go, Professor, one last question. You mentioned very rightly about the focus on states needing to be there, not just the center, but states. In fact, the economic survey, you've written many in your time. But
what do you mean your time? I'm not that old.
No, in your time in the government, I mean, as CEA. But what I'm saying is that when you mentioned this, I am drawn to the fact that the economic survey this year talks about a tripartite compact between the government, the public sector, and the private sector.
Yes.
The government, the states, and the private sector.
Yeah.
Now, do you think in today's polarized environment, politically, I don't want you to give a political answer, but there is politics at the heart of it in any case, and the private sector's still somewhat reluctant to invest the way the government is wanting it to. Do you think that's a fair assessment, an assumption to make?
No, I think it's a fair, ambition to have, or it's a very good ambition to have. As I said, in a federal structure, and whenever one looks at the conversation that happens, about states and center, oftentimes states and, many times actually sort of supported and encouraged by the media only talk about their power. They do not talk about the responsibility. We need to put equal focus on the responsibility, because they are two sides of the same coin. And this is really critical. I'm saying this one more time so that, my media friends actually listen to this and put the spotlight where it's necessary. Equally, I think the industry, and here, when it comes to the model of development, if you go back and read our history, Milton Friedman was actually called by Jawaharlal Nehru, when the Planning Commission was being, was in its infancy, and he talked about saying, you have your comparative advantage is that you have labor. And so your economic model actually needs to be, suited to that. Now, don't want to get into history, what we did, etc. But there's an important lesson here for our industry as well. Because when we think about investment or, the model that, that we follow, there's oftentimes this problem of commons that comes about, which is every firm on its own wants to, let's say, at the margin, try and move more towards capital. And maybe less towards or move away from labor. But then what happens is when you start accumulating all this actually at the level of the economy, if every firm does that, that's the problem of commons, then at the aggregate level you actually don't get enough job creation, you don't therefore get enough consumption, and eventually what happens due to the problem of commons, it hurts the same firms themselves, the industry. And here's where coordination is an important aspect, and therefore fora like CII, FICCI and ASSOCHAM need to recognize this problem of commons and highlight that if we actually move towards and more labor intensive, but at the same time I think I'm not asking for for them to sort of move away from their profit function, but in that profit function itself is embedded this problem of commons. If they can see that and thereby coordinate to avoid the problem of commons, they themselves will reap the rewards. And that's the point that in other words, what I'm trying to say, sort of technically we're sort of industry is stuck in a suboptimal Nash equilibrium, which they need to get over through coordination and getting over this problem of commons. That will be something that really will help the industry. And also there's one more comment that I want to make, and this is it's covered in the book. The economic strategy that I've laid out actually has 4 pillars to it. The first one is macroeconomic focus on growth, second is on social and economic inclusion, and third is wealth creation, ethical wealth creation, fourth is virtuous cycle. Here I want to make a comment because many times I actually hear some demagoguery about which basically creates this artificial tension between wealth creation and what is good for the common citizen, or things like there is this sort of syndrome of Bollywood 20 years back where there would be these jingles from Hollywood that they transport and just change the lyrics and copy paste. In many of our economic narratives we see that, especially on inequality, for instance. The narratives that, let's say, Thomas Piketty is talking about for Europe or the US, we have to be careful to actually not transport that without contextualizing it to India. And in the book I actually show, if you correlate in the advanced economies, inequality on the x-axis and socio-economic indicators on the y-axis, you get a negative correlation for advanced economies. But when you do the same thing, same data, but for India, same proxies, you get no correlation. And this is important actually, that we don't cut paste such narratives like, the Bollywood of yesteryear, era. At the same time also, and embedded in this is the concept of the wealth creation. Yeah. And here it is really critical to understand that there is no tension. In fact, wealth creation is what actually helps job creation too.
One of your surveys you actually dwelt a lot on.
I did. And, I want to now leave a couple of examples for the audience and for, for our participants to latch on to here. See, as I've mentioned, I come from a very humble background, low middle class family. When we were young, we used to have a help who used to come and, help clean dishes. Some months we could afford, some months we could not. The important point is that, even in those months when we had the house help, this lady used to be working in 9 other families. In other words, 10 lower middle class families together were providing 1/10 of a household help's job. The local jeweler, who was actually a significant wealth creator, in contrast, was providing jobs, 100 jobs across both his business and his home. In other words, he was creating 1,000 times as much compared to a low middle class family, which was not creating that much wealth. So this correlation that you can start seeing. And finally, and this is, having never done any consulting and therefore not eaten salt of any industrialist, I can say with absolute authenticity here that whether it's industrialist X, Y or Z, They're not, putting their wealth actually stacked as, rupee bills in their pillows or their mattresses. They're putting it in companies. Companies, the ones that we basically give all of us jobs. These are private sector companies. So I think, if we start understanding that this artificial tension that is created between wealth creation and inequality is used as another sort of way of bringing the same argument in, versus what is good for the common citizen. I think it's time they start recognizing that that is basically an attempt to sort of pull some wool on our eyes and thereby, point out what is the true economic phenomena there. Thank you very much.
Krishnamurthy Subramanian at his very best, as always. Thank you very much, and a very big warm round of applause.
Thank you, Dr. Subramanian. Would request you.